My name is David, and this is a story I wish I could forget. But the thing is, I can't. And as much as I want to pretend it was all some terrible nightmare, the truth is I know it wasn't. It was last summer when I first found myself driving through the small, rundown town of Everwood. I had just taken a new job as a project manager for a construction firm, and I had to check on some properties for a client. Everwood seemed like the perfect place to get the work done. Quiet. Isolated. The kind of place where no one would bother me. I pulled into the only motel in town, the Everwood Inn, a place that looked like it hadn't seen any real business in years. The front desk clerk, an older woman with a pale face and sunken eyes, barely acknowledged me as I checked in. She handed me a key without a word, and when I asked where I could grab a bite to eat, she just pointed to the end of the street. The town felt dead, like something was missing. It wasn't just the lack of people. It was the eerie silence that hung in the air, like the town had been forgotten by time. But I shrugged it off, thinking it was just because of the late hour. I drove over to the diner, hoping to grab something quick before heading back to my room. When I walked in, I was greeted by a gruff man named Bill, the only one working the counter. He gave me a forced smile, and we exchanged pleasantries before I sat down. The diner was small, with yellowing tiles on the floor and booths that looked like they hadn't been cleaned in ages. The air smelled like grease and something else. Something off. Bill served me a burger, and I asked about the town. He gave me one of those half smiles, the kind that don't quite reach the eyes. "You won't find much around here," he said, leaning in slightly. "People come and people leave. That's how it's always been." I figured it was just his way of being cryptic, so I didn't think much of it. But as I ate, I noticed something strange. The windows of the diner were covered in grime, but more than that, the street outside seemed empty. It was like the town was frozen, locked in time. I finished my meal, paid, and left, but as I walked back to my truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I turned around, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but there was nothing. Still, I couldn't shake the unease as I got back to the motel. When I entered my room, I locked the door behind me and took a deep breath, trying to calm my nerves. I had been in small towns before, and I knew the drill: quiet, peaceful, and maybe a little strange. But this felt different. Something was wrong here. It wasn't until I tried to sleep that the real terror began. The first strange thing was the noise. At first, I thought it was just the old building creaking, but then I realized the sound was coming from outside. It was a low, almost rhythmic thumping, like something heavy was being dragged across the pavement. I pulled back the curtains and peeked outside, but the street was empty. Nothing but the pale moonlight reflecting off the cracked pavement. I tried to ignore it and went back to bed, but the thumping continued, growing louder and closer. It wasn't until I heard the faint sound of whispering that I finally couldn't take it anymore. The whispers seemed to be coming from the other side of the wall, and they sounded almost like they were talking about me. I grabbed my phone to check the time. 3:17 a.m. Felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something. That's when the knocking started. It was soft at first, like a gentle tap on the door. But then it grew louder, more insistent. My heart started racing as the knocking became frantic, as if someone, or something, was desperate to get in. I stood frozen, unable to move. My mind screamed at me to open the door, but I couldn't. Something told me that if I did, I wouldn't survive the night. I finally mustered the courage to look through the peephole. What I saw on the other side made my blood run cold. I don't know how long I stood there, staring through that tiny peephole, my breath shallow and erratic. What I saw didn't make sense, at least not in the way anything should. There was a man, or at least I think it was a man, standing at my door. His face was pale, almost lifeless, and his eyes, they weren't right. They were wide, too wide, and the irises were a strange, unnatural shade of yellow, like something was rotting behind them. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, staring at the door. I pulled back, my mind racing. Who the hell was this guy? Was it some kind of prank? A local? Or was something far worse at play? The knocking started again, louder this time, as if he knew I was watching. My heart hammered in my chest, and I backed away from the door slowly, my eyes darting around the room. The whispering was growing louder now, so loud that I could make out a few words: "David." I snapped my head toward the window, but there was nothing outside. The streetlights cast eerie shadows, and I saw nothing but emptiness. It felt like I was being hunted, like I was the prey in some twisted game. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my phone, but there was no signal, nothing. The panic began to rise, flooding my chest with a hot rush of fear. I tried to call the front desk, but the line was dead. The motel was completely isolated. The town, as quiet as a graveyard, had no way of getting help. I paced back and forth, torn between staying inside my room and running. But when I heard the soft shuffle of feet outside the door, the decision was made for me. I had no choice. I pulled open the window and climbed out onto the fire escape, the metal railing cold under my hands. The thumping sound, now rhythmic and deep, echoed from somewhere close, and I knew whatever was out there was coming closer. The night air was heavy with something unexplainable, like the whole town was holding its breath, waiting for something awful to happen. I moved as quickly as I could, darting between the shadows of the motel, trying to avoid being seen. The town's few streetlights flickered erratically, casting strange, warped shadows across the cracked pavement. As I turned a corner, I froze. There, standing in the middle of the street, was the man. Or what was left of him. His body was thin and hunched, like he was too tall for his own frame. His clothes were ragged, and his face had started to decay, peeling away in patches, like something out of a nightmare. But it was his eyes, those yellow eyes. They weren't just wide anymore, they were gleaming, burning through the darkness. And that's when I saw it, the reflection. Behind him, in the dim light of the street lamp, there were figures. Dozens of them, all standing motionless, just watching. Their faces were the same as his, hollow and decayed, their eyes glowing with that same sickening yellow hue. I stumbled backward, my chest tightening with dread. My first instinct was to run, but I didn't know where to go. The town was a labyrinth of empty streets, and it felt like every alley, every building was closing in on me. I turned and sprinted down the next street, heart racing, breath coming in sharp gasps. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't shake the feeling that they were always just a few steps behind me. I was starting to panic when I saw a light up ahead, a building. Maybe the diner? It was the only place I had seen with any sign of life. I reached the door and tried to push it open, but it was locked. My hands trembled as I banged on the glass, screaming for help. But the sound that came from the inside wasn't the voice of Bill or anyone else I had seen. It was a low, guttural sound, like someone or something was waiting for me. I turned around to run, but it was too late. They were there, surrounding me. The figures from the street were closing in, their footsteps in perfect unison. And that's when I realized the truth. Everwood wasn't a town. It was a trap. I don't know how I didn't collapse right there in the street, the weight of what was happening crashing down on me like a ton of bricks. The figures were moving closer, their hollow eyes fixed on me, but they didn't speak. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was enough to freeze the blood in my veins. I turned around in a blind panic, my mind a chaotic swirl of terror, desperate to find some way out. But every direction I looked, there they were. Every shadow seemed to harbor another one of those twisted, pale faces. I stumbled back, my body shaking uncontrollably. My breath came in shallow gasps, and for a moment, I thought I might faint. Then, something strange happened. The figures stopped. I thought maybe I had passed out and was dreaming. But no, the figures stood perfectly still, their eyes locked on me, their twisted bodies motionless. It was like they were waiting for something, a signal, command. And then I heard it, a soft voice, barely a whisper, but it cut through the air like a knife. David, it was coming from behind me. I spun around, heart pounding, to see that pale-faced man from earlier. He was standing at the end of the street now, not moving, just staring. His mouth stretched into a grin that wasn't human. It was wrong, unnatural. The kind of grin you see on something that's never been alive. You don't belong here, David. I didn't know what to do. My legs wouldn't move. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body just wouldn't obey. Then, from somewhere in the distance, I heard something else. The unmistakable sound of someone or something laughing. It was deep, throaty, and it echoed in the empty streets like it came from all around me. The air seemed to grow colder, the night darker. The figures started moving again, but this time there was no hesitation. No slow, creeping steps. They were on me in an instant, grabbing at my arms, pulling me toward the man at the end of the street. I fought. I struggled. But their hands felt like iron, cold, unyielding. And the more I fought, the more they tightened their grip. You shouldn't have come, the man said, his voice almost a hiss now. You shouldn't have come to Everwood. This is where things end. I was terrified, but something inside me, some survival instinct, kicked in. I couldn't let them take me. Not like this. I managed to break free from their grip, though the struggle was barely enough to give me any room. I ran. I ran without thinking, tearing down the street, my feet pounding against the asphalt, my breath ragged and harsh. But the street seemed to stretch endlessly. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape. The town was like a maze, no exits, no relief. And as I turned a corner, I found myself facing the same twisted faces, the same yellow eyes. But then something different happened. The air grew heavy, thick with an unnatural pressure, and the ground beneath my feet seemed to tremble. I stumbled, nearly falling to the ground as the world around me began to warp. The streetlights flickered violently, casting shadows that stretched and twisted unnaturally. The buildings around me seemed to shift, their shapes distorting, bending like they were alive. And then I saw it. At the far end of the street, a tall, dark figure emerged from the shadows. It was massive, its form shrouded in darkness, too large for any human being. I couldn't make out any details, but there was no mistaking the presence. It wasn't human. In a heartbeat, it moved toward me, faster than anything that should be capable of. And I realized, then, the truth of Everwood. The town wasn't just haunted by the twisted figures that walked its streets. No, it was something far older, far darker. The figures were just its servants, carrying out its will. And I was the prey. The massive figure reached out with a long skeletal hand, its fingers tipped with claws that seemed to gleam in the flickering light. There was nowhere to run now. I could feel its coldness seeping into my skin, a wave of pure, unrelenting fear crashing over me. The whispers started again, louder now, surrounding me from all sides. The air felt thick with the weight of something ancient, something hungry. "You've seen too much, David," the figure growled, its voice low and guttural, sending chills down my spine. "And now you belong to us." I tried to scream, to call for help, but no sound came out. My throat was tight, as if something was crushing it from the inside. The world was closing in around me, the darkness pressing against my body, smothering me. But just as the darkness began to swallow me whole, I saw a flash of light, a fleeting moment of hope, and then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold, damp ground. My head throbbed, and I felt disoriented, like I had been ripped from one nightmare and thrown into another. The world around me was still, eerily still. The cold air bit at my skin, and I could hear the faint sound of wind rustling through the trees in the distance. I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, as if I had been dragged across miles of rough terrain. My vision was blurry, and I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear the fog that clouded my mind. Where was I? The last thing I remembered was that thing, the creature in the street, the shadows, the figures. But now everything was silent. No twisted faces staring at me, no dark figure looming over me, just stillness. I slowly pushed myself to my feet, the world tilting slightly as I stood. I was in what looked like a wooded area, the trees surrounding me like silent sentinels. The path I stood on was narrow and uneven, barely visible through the thick undergrowth. I glanced around, trying to make sense of where I was. There were no signs of life, no buildings or lights, just dense forest and darkness stretching on endlessly. Had they taken me here? I wondered, fear creeping back into my chest. Had they dragged me out into the woods to finish what they had started? But then something caught my eye. In the distance, there was a faint glow, the flicker of light barely visible through the trees. I felt a surge of desperation, of hope. Maybe it was another town. Maybe I could find someone, anyone, who could help me. I started walking toward the light, every step cautious, my senses on high alert. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the deeper I went into the woods, the more oppressive the silence became. The trees seemed to close in around me, and I could feel their shadows pressing down on me like a weight. When I finally reached the source of the light, my heart sank. It wasn't a town. It was the Everwood Inn. I stared at the old motel, its windows dark and lifeless, its sign hanging crookedly above the door. The place looked even more decrepit than it had when I first arrived. The parking lot was empty, and the front door was wide open, as if inviting me in. How is this possible? I thought. I left the motel. I ran. I couldn't have. But there it was, Everwood Inn, unchanged, unmoving. And I couldn't shake the feeling that the motel was somehow alive. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to turn around and run, but something compelled me to move closer. Maybe I was just too tired, too broken from everything that had happened, but I couldn't ignore the pull. It was as if the motel was calling to me, like it knew something I didn't. I stepped cautiously inside. The lobby was exactly as it had been when I first checked in, dimly lit, dusty, and filled with an air of neglect. The front desk was still manned by the same woman, her pale face as lifeless as ever, her eyes hollow and unblinking. She's not real, I thought, my mind snapping into a strange clarity. None of this is real, but I couldn't stop myself. I walked to the front desk, my feet dragging, my body moving like it had no control of its own. The woman didn't speak. She just stared at me with those hollow eyes, her lips curling into that same sickening smile. I tried to speak, but my voice was lost. I felt like I was underwater, my mouth moving but no sound coming out. I reached out to grab her arm, to shake her, to make her tell me what was going on, but just as my hand brushed her skin, something strange happened. Her face shifted. It was subtle at first, just a flicker like the shadows moving under her skin. But then it twisted, her eyes going black, her smile stretching unnaturally wide as though her face was trying to tear itself apart. I staggered back, my heart hammering in my chest. I turned to run, but the door slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. The walls began to close in, the air growing thick and suffocating. The ground under my feet seemed to shift like it was swallowing me whole. I looked around in a panic, but everything was changing. The room stretched, the floor buckling and creaking as if the entire motel was warping, distorting into something else. The whispering started again, those voices, faint at first, then growing louder, filling the room with a guttural, maddening chorus. "You should have stayed away, David." The words echoed in my head, and for a moment I thought I might lose my mind. The walls were alive now, pulsating with the rhythm of the whispers, the shadows dancing in ways that weren't possible. The woman behind the desk was gone. In her place, those figures, those yellow-eyed, twisted figures, lined the walls, staring at me, their mouths moving in unison with the whispers. And that's when I realized. I hadn't just entered the Everwood Inn. I had entered their world. I didn't know how much longer I could stand it. The pressure in the room was suffocating, the walls closing in with every passing second, the shadows shifting and dancing in ways that should have been impossible. The whispers were deafening now, an overwhelming chorus of voices, each one calling my name, taunting me, mocking me. "David! David!" I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the sounds, but it was no use. The walls themselves seemed to be alive, vibrating with the voices, the air thick with an oppressive energy that threatened to crush me. I turned desperately toward the door, hoping, no, praying, that I could escape. But it was no longer the door I had entered through. It had changed. The doorframe twisted, contorted, the wood rotting and peeling away, revealing nothing but blackness beyond it. The more I stared at it, the more it seemed to draw me in, as though the darkness beyond was pulling at my very soul. "You cannot leave, David." I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice had come from behind me, and when I turned, I saw him, the figure, the one I had encountered earlier in the street, the pale man with the wide, unnatural eyes. He was standing in the center of the room now, his grin stretching impossibly wide across his decaying face. His eyes glowed that sickening yellow, and his skin seemed to twitch, like it was fighting to hold itself together. "You shouldn't have come back." His voice was cold, like a whisper carried on the wind, and yet it filled the room like thunder. He took a step toward me, and with each step, the room seemed to distort, the walls bending, the floor groaning under the weight of something ancient and hungry. This place. Everwood, it was never a town. The figure's voice echoed, each word sending a wave of cold dread through me. It was never meant to be a home for anyone. It was meant to be a trap. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I felt like I was suffocating under the weight of his words, the meaning behind them sinking in like a stone in my chest. What do you mean?" I gasped, my voice hoarse, barely a whisper against the rising chaos around me. The figure's grin widened even further, his eyes now glowing with a blinding intensity. "You're in our world now, David. Everwood isn't a town. It's a prison, a place where souls are kept. And you were chosen." I staggered backward, my mind spinning, trying to comprehend the words he was saying. A prison? A place where souls are kept? It didn't make sense. It couldn't. But the way the walls were closing in, the way the shadows were reaching for me, I knew deep down that he was right. But why me? I breathed, my voice trembling. "Why did you choose me?" The figure tilted his head, his smile fading slightly as if considering the question. Because you were curious, David. You wanted to know. You thought you could survive. But Everwood chooses its victims carefully. The ones who come here, who look too closely, they become part of it. I couldn't stop myself from trembling. I was trapped. There was no escape. And I was beginning to realize that it wasn't just the motel that was alive, it was the entire town, its very existence, feeding on those who dared to wander too close. What happens now? I whispered, more to myself than to him. The figure's grin returned, but it was different now. There was something final in it. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. You belong to Everwood now. The room seemed to lurch around me, the floor buckling beneath my feet, the walls warping and twisting like they were made of liquid. I stumbled, my legs giving way beneath me, but there was nowhere to fall. I felt the weight of the air pressing in from all sides, suffocating me, crushing me. You can never leave, the figure hissed. No one ever leaves Everwood. Not alive. Not ever. I turned, trying to run, trying to escape, but it was no use. The shadows closed in around me, their cold fingers dragging at my skin. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, until it was all I could hear, all I could feel. I fell to my knees, overwhelmed by the darkness, by the suffocating presence of the place. The last thing I saw was the pale figure, his eyes gleaming with that sickening yellow light, before everything went black. When I woke up, I was standing in the center of the street. The town of Everwood sprawled out around me, just as I had seen it before. The air was thick with the same oppressive silence. The streets were empty, the buildings standing like silent monuments to something long dead. But I wasn't alone. The figures were there. Hundreds of them, standing in the shadows, their eyes glowing with that same unnatural yellow. They watched me, their hollow gazes fixed on me, their mouths moving in perfect unison, whispering my name. David. I realized then. The town hadn't just taken me. It had changed me. I wasn't a visitor anymore. I wasn't a victim. I was one of them. I had become part of Everwood, and I would never leave. Not alive. Not ever. And neither will you. I had barely begun to process what had happened when the first figure approached me. A man, or what had once been a man. His skin was ashen, stretched too thin over bone, and his eyes were those same glowing yellow orbs that haunted the town. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, and his face was locked in a permanent, grotesque grin that seemed too wide for the limits of human expression. He took slow, deliberate steps toward me, the sound of his feet scraping against the cracked pavement almost drowned by the whispers that echoed all around. I didn't move, couldn't. It was like I was glued to the spot, rooted to the ground by a force I couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, as if the town itself was speaking to me. No, not speaking. Insisting I understood. I had always been here. He stopped in front of me, his eyes boring into mine. His voice was low, raspy, as if it hadn't been used in centuries. Welcome home, David. I felt a shiver run down my spine, the words reverberating deep within me. There was no escaping. I knew it. Everwood had a way of making you forget the world outside, of erasing the parts of you that had once been free. I wasn't just a visitor here, I was a part of it now. A permanent piece of the puzzle that the town had been assembling, pulling more souls into its twisted embrace. The figure's grin widened and the others began to move, stepping out of the shadows, surrounding me, circling. There were hundreds of them now, their hollow eyes all trained on me, all of them speaking at once, the cacophony of whispers growing deafening. David. Stay with us, David. You'll never leave. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sounds, trying to tell myself it wasn't real. But I knew it was. This was it. This was my fate. Everwood had claimed me, and now I would be one of them. One of the figures, one of the whispers, forever. The pale figure who had spoken to me first stepped forward, his hand reaching out. I knew I couldn't resist, but I did. I stepped back, trembling, and he stopped, his eyes never leaving mine. Don't be afraid, David. His voice was almost tender now, though it still held that eerie, otherworldly edge. You'll understand soon enough. You will join us, but not right now. Not yet. There's more to see. More for you to experience. A sick feeling churned in my stomach as he took a step back, the others around me seeming to nod in unison. They were all waiting for something, for me to accept my place here. More? I whispered, my voice cracked and raw. What do you mean, more? The figure smiled again, the edges of his mouth stretching impossibly wide. "The truth, David. The truth about Everwood. And about you." Before I could respond, the ground beneath my feet seemed to shift, like the earth itself was breathing, shifting. The entire town began to tremble, the buildings warping as if they were alive, and the figures started to disperse, moving in strange, unnatural patterns, their eyes still fixed on me. And then, everything went dark. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I awoke, I was no longer standing in the middle of the street. I was back at the Everwood Inn, standing in the exact same spot I had been before, only now it was different. The air felt thicker, the walls pulsating, as though the motel itself was alive, breathing in rhythm with the whispers. The clerk, the same pale woman with sunken eyes, stood behind the desk again, her smile just as vacant as before. "You're awake," she said, her voice soft and cold. I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but no words came out. My throat was dry, constricted. The whispers continued, gnawing at my thoughts. The faces of the figures were in every corner of my vision, and I could feel them, watching, waiting. "Is this it?" I finally croaked, the question slipping from my lips without thinking. "Am I supposed to just stay here?" The woman didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly as though considering the question. Her eyes bored into mine, and I could feel the weight of her gaze like a physical presence. "Not just stay," she said, her voice a whisper now, barely audible. "You'll understand soon, David. You'll become one of us." The room around me began to fade, warping and twisting like I was losing my grip on reality. The walls seemed to melt into darkness, and the air became thick with an overpowering sense of inevitability. "But what if I don't want to?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper against the overwhelming pressure. She leaned in closer, her face now inches from mine, her eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. "You don't have a choice, David. No one does." Suddenly, the door to the motel room slammed open with a force that nearly knocked me off my feet. I stumbled back, my heart racing, but when I looked up, I saw something that froze me in place. In the doorway stood a figure shrouded in darkness, its outline indistinct, but there was something familiar about it. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. The figure stepped into the room, its face hidden in shadows, but the moment it took a step forward, I saw the reflection of my own yellow eyes staring back at me. I could feel it, this wasn't just a person. This was me, reborn into whatever this town was. I turned away in horror, but the figure was already beside me. I could feel it, its cold breath on my neck, the weight of its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. And then, without warning, I heard the whisper, my own voice, only it didn't sound like mine. "You belong to Everwood now, David." The last thing I saw before the darkness took me was the room around me filling with those twisted, grinning figures, my own reflection joining them, smiling wide, eyes glowing. And I knew deep down that it was too late. There was no escaping now. This was my new home. Forever. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't in the Everwood Inn. The town was gone, vanished from sight. All that remained was darkness. Nothing but the hollow void, as if the very essence of the place had been stripped away. I felt no ground beneath my feet, no walls, no ceiling. Just an endless blackness pressing in from all sides. The air was cold, too cold, and it felt as though I was suspended in time itself, caught between two worlds. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was trapped in a place that felt like a prison, yet there was something else there, something watching. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. I didn't need to see its face to know who it was. It was the same one from before, the pale man with the yellow eyes, standing just beyond my reach. His grin was wide, unsettling, stretching unnaturally, and his eyes gleamed in the dark, reflecting a cold hunger. "You've been here before, David." The voice was familiar, yet distant, like an echo bouncing around in my head. It wasn't just his voice, it was the voice of the entire town, the voices of all the souls that had been trapped here before me. I could feel them now surrounding me, inescapable. This place, the figure continued, stepping closer, has no beginning, no end. It exists in a space outside of time, and it claims those who are curious enough to find it. "And now you belong to it, David." I tried to speak, to shout, to break free of whatever force held me in place, but my voice failed me. My body felt like it was sinking deeper into the void, weighed down by an invisible force, as if the very darkness was consuming me. You were never meant to leave, the figure said, his voice tinged with both sorrow and satisfaction. Everwood is not just a town. It's a prison, a trap for those who seek the unknown, for those who venture too far. But it is also a sanctuary for those who accept it. I felt the weight of his words sink in. My mind was clouded, my thoughts scattered. Everwood, was it real? Had I truly been there? Was any of it real? The figure's presence was overwhelming, like the embodiment of the town itself, its dark, twisted heart. But I don't want to be here, I managed to say, my voice weak. I don't want to stay. I want to go back. The figure's eyes flashed, almost amused. That is not for you to decide, David. You've already crossed the line. You've seen the truth. And now you are one of us. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to fight, to scream, to do something. And then I realized this was it. The final choice. I could feel it deep inside me, a final shred of will, of defiance. You can leave. The voice came not from the figure, but from somewhere deep within me. The town, the figures, the voices, all of it. It was like a light was flickering in the darkness. A small sliver of hope. You can leave, but only if you let go of everything. If you accept what you are now, what you have become. I closed my eyes and the words echoed through my mind. I wasn't sure I could do it. I wasn't sure I wanted to do it. To accept this, to let go of everything I had been. But deep down, I knew there was no escaping Everwood unless I did. I had been chosen. This was my destiny. David. The voice was softer now, almost kind. You are not alone. We are with you. I took a deep breath and let go. The darkness swallowed me whole. When I woke up again, I was back. The Everwood Inn, the town, the street, I was standing in the same place I had been before, only this time something was different. The air felt lighter. The silence wasn't oppressive. There was no whispering, no hollow eyes. The town looked the same, but I could feel that it had changed, that it was no longer a trap, no longer something dark and evil. I looked around and for the first time I saw it, others. People like me, trapped here, but now free. They were walking around, smiling, going about their business as though nothing had ever happened. They were the ones who had accepted their fate, who had let go of their fear and embraced Everwood. I felt a strange calm wash over me. I wasn't alone. And as I looked at the pale man, the figure who had once haunted my every waking moment, he nodded at me. No longer a grin on his face, just understanding. You've made your choice, David. Welcome to your new home. And for the first time since I had arrived, I understood. There was no escaping Everwood. Not for anyone. But in the end, that wasn't what mattered. What mattered was that I had become a part of it. Forever. Did you like these stories? Write in the comments. And please write what you didn't like. It will be useful for me to know your opinion. And I will improve my work. Thank you. Subscribe to my channel and click the bell so as not to miss new stories. I try for you.